Morning, everyone. I'm Randy Morris, and I'm the director of the Santa Cruz County Human Services Department, and want to call out my city partner, Ralph, from the city of Santa Cruz. This is a joint effort between two public jurisdictions, even though I'll do most of the talking. Why human services? Not going to go through the whole history, but there's probably a few people who maybe don't have this history. We'll do a little bit of deeper dive when I turn it over to Nicole's. Having spent 26 years in county human services government, but up until a year and a half ago in another jurisdiction, this is a really interesting decision this community's made over 3 decades ago, which is to pool a large amount of general fund money and put it out to the community in contracts. And way before my tenure, probably 4 directors ago, the Board of Supervisors decided to have the County Human Services Department be the administrator of those contracts. So we were just sort of the administrative arm. And then, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a whole series of discussions happened that many in this call were part of or aware of. I wasn't here. Very controversial. A lot of people agreed with it, a lot of controversy, which is to shift from the past practice to the current practice, which is to have an actual competitive public procurement with some accountability measures built in. And this is the second chapter of that effort, and it's going to be an iterative process, a lot of lessons learned. And I hope to be here when we do this a third time, and I hope when we do it the third time, it'll be even a little bit easier and better and more agreeable to everybody than this time. If I would need to define the energy level that I hope we achieve today, and in whatever tone I can set today, it's been quite an arc since the concept that led to a board vote to then have a competitive RFP, which now we're in the 5th year of that cycle, to getting ready for this one with lots of dialogue, lots of feedback. Today is really, in my estimation, a pivot point from lots of conceptual discussion, engaging in dialogue, kind of doing rear view mirror lessons learned to, and this is my invitation to you all on the call, what would you do if you were in our shoes? Ralph at the city, me at the county. We have some really interesting, complicated, not easy to answer decisions to make. And as public servants, it's our responsibility to bring to our elected bodies, Ralph, the city council, and a subcommittee before that, me to the board on 2 occasions, which I'll talk about, a proposed framework. And well, I'll speak for myself. I am very sincere that I welcome and value your perspective on the best way to answer some of these questions that you will hear asked to you today. So I really, truly invite you to say, what would you do if you're in my shoes? You have your shoes, like this would make it easier for me. If I'm a service provider who's going to apply for funds, if you're a funder on this call, you've done it and you've put money out. And so, we invite your feedback. The tone or energy or vibe, as this community calls it, that I'm hoping to strive is when I have the responsibility to present to the Board of Supervisors a framework that it truly is reflective of your thinking. I don't sit in your shoes as a service provider or a funder in a philanthropy. So help us. We are going to take, and you are going to hear today, a consolidation of all these discussions into some very narrow focused questions. And we really are going to listen to them, and we're going to walk through them and sort of help bring forward to the elected bodies some ideas. You're going to hear today a deeper dive of sort of the most recent activity that's played out, but I want to just hit the highlights, particularly for those who are new, but as a reminder, the deputy director who's not here today, Emily Bali for Human Services, who was here then, myself, and Nicole from Optimal Solutions, we presented to the Board of Supervisors in March an annual report and said we are just initiating the process to get ready for an RFP in the fall, and here are the series of events that will play out. At that meeting, my elected body directed us to engage funders. That includes city jurisdictions, of which the city of Santa Cruz is an active participant, but other cities, particularly Watsonville, have general fund money they put out to service providers to work towards alignment for collective impact, and also service providers. So that led to 2 funder meetings. Last week, a meeting with many of you service providers, and today a meeting of everybody together. So that's kind of the arc. What I want to let you know is this all leads to, and we'll talk about this in the slides once we get to the formal presentation, a series of events that are going to happen after this meeting. And I want to walk through why today is not the last opportunity to give us feedback as we're kind of forming and bringing together ideas. So number one, The questions that I'll speak to a little bit later, and you'll be queued up for breakout rooms, they are going to be put in an open survey after this meeting, so that anybody who feels like the breakout rooms or the dialogue that occurred today, you missed a window, you had a lot more you wanted to say, because our intent to sincerely get your feedback, we know is limited in this pandemic environment and virtual. So after this meeting, I believe it'll probably be tomorrow, the Nicoles will be sending out an email, and in there will be a survey. And in that survey is share as much more as you want with us about, help us think through these questions. So that's going to be another opportunity. Number two, in that survey is going to be a question: do you feel like it would be better if we actually scheduled one more video meeting in early September? So we will take your feedback. You might be exhausted. No, we share our feedback. May the force be with you. But if you feel like, you know, we really do, I think we just one more meeting, we could kind of crystallize a few things. We are prepared for and open to having another meeting in early September. So please consider that as you go through this meeting today. Okay, so then what pivots is, there is a meeting that's going to occur, I believe, Nicole's, it's tentatively scheduled for August 30th, and that is the core steering committee, which, if as described to me, this is correct, it's a representative group of all interested stakeholders in core. That meeting is going to be a forum where the core steering committee members are going to be given feedback about what happened in the meeting and the survey, and one more chance for the steering committee to give some feedback. And then that is the pivot point for at least county, the two final forums. And this is where it becomes public process, Brown Act, procurement. We, the county, are tentatively scheduled, and I say tentative because the board can always direct us otherwise, to go to the Board of Supervisors on September 28th. Materials are posted Thursday night before the Tuesday, September 28th meeting. And in that meeting, we are going to unveil publicly our best thinking, informed by today's meeting and the survey and the previous meetings, a framework for this RFP, where a lot of these hairy, complicated questions we're going to be recommending as staff. You have an opportunity to read that materials Thursday night. You have an opportunity to call board offices, and you have an opportunity to virtually, or now in chambers, unless something changes, give public feedback to the Board of Supervisors, who at the end of that presentation to the board will give refined direction to the Human Services Department to go back and then start crafting the RFP. So please know we're working very hard to not put the Board of Supervisors in a position of having to arbitrate questions where we're all polarized, but we will get as far as we can, and you still have an opportunity to make public comment, and our elected officials will make their decisions based on our recommendation, your feedback. And then we as staff will go back, we will write the RFP, the materials that go with the RFP, and we are finalizing the date to make sure we work in alignment with the city. So as close to possible, the city of Santa Cruz and the county are around the same time. We will then go to the board probably a month later, end of October, or as late as early November, and release the RFP, the scoring materials. And that is one more opportunity, because that RFP cannot be released until the board approves it at that board date. So you have one more chance to read it that Thursday night. Great job, county, which is what I hope. Or if you're like, they didn't listen, you have a chance to give feedback to the board and make public comment. And the board has the responsibility to give final direction to the county to make any refinements or approve the release of the RFP. So I'm sharing that all with you to just let you know, if a democracy is functioning, which we have questions whether it's happening in DC or not, but in this kind of humble little Santa Cruz County, if the democracy is functioning well, I just want to be really transparent about the many opportunities we're trying to create before final decisions are made, because it's a very serious decision. How do you decide to give out this amount of money? It's a meaningful amount of money, but it's not enough. So let me kind of give a quick highlight before I turn it back to Nicole of this comment I made about sort of where we are. There's been a tremendous amount of work by Optimal Solutions and county and city staff who've been meeting between these meetings to try to actively listen to the feedback we've been receiving, distill it, summarize it, report it back to you. And at this point, we find the type of feedback we're getting that falls into two buckets. One is, wow, the funders and the service providers got some great questions and we don't totally know the answer. So here's some questions that we want to keep working on with you. And then a second bucket is, those are good questions, but public procurement practices and law and regulations don't allow us to be able to do that. And we are going to be transparent today in sharing with you those two buckets. So what is the buckets where we have and want dialogue and collaboration and we want your help? They really fall into two categories. One is allocation methodology, comma, with an equity lens. I think we all agree equity is critical, but there is no state or federal mandate for how we put general fund money out in the community by what? By population, by core condition. So we have ideas, but we really want to hear from you as people providing service in the community and to our funder colleagues on the call. What ideas do you have? Because we as staff have to at some point make a recommendation to the board. And then number two, and I'd say the one that raises a lot of controversy from past concerns, is how's the county going to make decisions? What is the review process going to look like? Who's going to be on the rating panel? What's the rating sheets going to be? There is room there for us to continue to dialogue, and we really would like your feedback. I am going to close out with saying, I'm just looking at my notes that I wrote last night to make sure I cover what I thought I want to say. I want to repeat what my goal is in the position of responsibility I have. I am very committed to not putting the Board of Supervisors in a position of having to arbitrate profound differences between community and public. So I hope that we can work together to minimize those gaps. And the intent of this is to minimize confusion and maximize clarity, be transparent, and hopefully, because we are not going to get this perfect, this is too complicated a venture, that everybody feels like there was at least integrity in the process and we got as far as we could to be fair and reasonable. But I just hope nobody believes this is going to be perfect and everyone's going to be happy with this. It's going to be hopefully close and closer than it was before. So with that said, I have an opportunity to say a few more things later in the presentation. I'll turn it back to the Nicoles. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, and welcome everyone. We're happy to have you here as part of this work in progress to report on what we've been learning and to get your feedback, as Randy said, on the issues we're all grappling with. So before we dive into today's agenda, I just wanted to do some quick introductions. I think most of you know the Nicoles, Nicole Lezin, and my colleague and co-facilitator on CORE, Nicole Young. And our team also includes Stella Lauerman, who many of you know as our fantastic interpreter and translator of all our materials, which allows us to provide things for all of our core events in English and Spanish. And as part of that, we also have Gisela Carrasco and Jasmine Sanchez, who are doing the same work of translating English and Spanish back and forth in the chat. And that allows us to offer to you to communicate with us in whatever language is most comfortable for you. We hope you'll join us in sharing introductions with each other. Just in the chat, if you could say your name, title, the group or organization you're representing today. Some of you have already been doing that. We even have somebody who is joining us while driving on vacation. So kudos to you. And thanks everyone for being here. Today, we are going to dive into what we've heard from all of the meetings so far that Randy's described, but really to grapple with where we're left, as he said. What are the challenges and what are your insights? What would you do if you were in the counties and cities' shoes for trying to move forward with this RFP process? We've learned a lot and we're happy to share that today, but we're not quite there yet. So we're at a point where we have the opportunity to refine what we've heard and to move forward over the next several weeks in all the ways that Randy described. After you hear all of that, we'll take a very brief screen break because this is a longish meeting, and then we're going to split into smaller groups that will be facilitated by 4 of us to try to grapple with those questions that Randy raised. So we will have some time to talk to each other and to get another layer of insight from you today. Then we will gather back as a large group as we are right now to share what happened in the small groups. You'll have yet another opportunity to weigh in and hear what others were thinking and saying in those groups before we close out. And we'll do reminders throughout the meeting of all the things Randy described, the dates, the timing, how to participate. So that will be coming again, several different ways, different times, and some follow-up information after our meeting today. To guide those discussions in our large group and in the breakout groups, we're relying on some group agreements that were developed earlier in this process with input from many of you who are on this call today. And they include being present, which is always a challenge with lots of Zoom, back-to-back Zooming for all of us. And as I mentioned, just a longer than usual meeting today. And especially keeping an open mind. The issues that we're discussing about funding are difficult ones, and they are a challenge for every size of organization and coming out of a challenging time, a particularly challenging time. So the idea of questioning assumptions is important, but also something that we can hold each other to. And in order to do that, we have to listen to each other deeply, perhaps more deeply than usual, and to be kind to ourselves and to others on these discussions and calls. And being results-based has been a really important dimension of CORE itself and also of this process. So we're just putting that reminder there. And all of this together requires us to be vulnerable, to be really honest about our concerns and our needs, but also to recognize that this, as Randy said, this process is probably not going to make everybody happy. It's just part of the challenge that's faced by the city and county. But with your help and everyone sharing their vulnerabilities in this kind and open way, we hope that we can make the process better. And we're looking to all of you to hold each other accountable as well as us with these group agreements as we move forward.
Okay,
with that, I'll turn it back over to Nicole.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what we've been hearing and where we think this leaves us from those previous meetings that Randy was describing. And hopefully all of you received a copy of these slides in the reminder email that I sent out yesterday. We'll share these slides again because we know that it can be a lot of information that might take some time to digest, but we want to leave ourselves enough time for these small group discussions. So this will be a pretty high level, pretty brief overview of what we've been talking about in the meetings. And really, one of the main purposes of holding these, we've been calling them engagement meetings with funders and community partners, was to build a shared understanding of the core framework. And these core conditions hopefully look familiar to you, is a big part of that. But we really wanted to also use these meetings to get ideas about how to operationalize this concept of equity, make it concrete and actionable when we think about using the core framework in this upcoming core funding process. But also we saw these meetings as an opportunity to deepen the connections and communication and identify opportunities for greater alignment for collective impact among funders and community partners. And so we've been really pleased with the way that these discussions have gone and the level of just sharing and partnership and creativity, I think, that has come out of these discussions. And as Randy mentioned, these meetings that we've been holding this summer are really just one step in the overall core funding process, which in and of itself is just one point in time in an ongoing and broader engagement process. I mean, Nicole and I really think of it as, we've been engaging with and informing and working with many partners from nonprofits and public agencies and community groups, really ever since that first round of core funding. That has been kind of the purpose of Nicole and I working with the county, is to really take that initial model and work with partners to see how that could be continuously improved. And again, as Randy mentioned, the meetings themselves that we've held this summer, we had 2 meetings with funders. And, one of the, I think, exciting things that came out of that for us was that we, met and engaged with and talked with some funders that really had no involvement with CORE before. And so it was a chance to really build some shared language and ideas and excitement around the idea of greater collaboration and alignment for collective impact. And so we hope that those discussions with other local and regional funders will continue, that won't just be a one-time occurrence. The community partners meeting that we had last week had a great turnout. We have a similar great turnout again today. 66 people from 54 different agencies really brought out a kind of a depth of discussion that I don't think we'd been able to have so far. So we really appreciate everyone participating and many of you returning today. As Randy mentioned, we realized that not everyone has been able to attend these meetings, or you might think of brilliant things to say and share after these meetings. And so we'll use that survey. We'll leave it open for about a week for people to just add additional comments that could help inform our thinking. So I'll explain more about how that survey will be sent and how to answer it and what you can do with it in terms of who else you can share it with. We'll say more about that at the end of the meeting today. And as Randy said, there are some other meetings that will be happening, or different types of stakeholders or decision makers will be hearing some of these same concepts about the core framework. They'll be hearing the summaries of what's been coming out of these meetings. Again, if there's interest in having a core coffee chat in early September, where we bring back some of the additional ideas or kind of where the county and city are in their current thinking around the request for proposals, we can certainly schedule another core coffee chat on that. So lots of opportunities for input, all of it kind of leading up to that first big milestone that Randy was talking about, the presentation to the Board of Supervisors and the City of Santa Cruz Council about the framework for the request for proposals. And that really is kind of the first public meeting, right? The first step in that public process. So we will do everything we can to make sure that people are aware of all these opportunities, have opportunities to participate. And, we'll continue to provide technical assistance, not only through the core coffee chats, where we really try to cover topics that will be useful or might be relevant, or help, again, just help people feel more aware of what core is even before the RFP comes out. Once the RFP is released, we'll do similar workshops and individualized technical assistance like what was offered the first time around. So just really want to reassure you there will be lots of communication, lots of opportunities for input, lots of technical assistance to help us all, as Randy said, make this hopefully a better process than last time, but knowing that there will still be room for improvement, I am sure. And again, in these meetings, we've really been focusing on, building a shared understanding of what we call the core framework, which includes the vision statement, mission statement, values that were, again, developed through a lot of community engagement and partnership with many of you that are participating here. This is a big part of the work that we've been doing over the last few years, building these kinds of shared statements, including things like this concept of the 8 interconnected, interdependent core conditions for health and well-being with equity at the center. So a lot of it's just, building that shared language, but we also laid out, the situation that Randy described that the county and city are in, that there are, things that they know in terms of how, they want to go about approaching this next request for proposals and funding process. A lot of that is based on feedback that came out of the process evaluation that was done after the first round of core funding. So there's been this kind of ongoing learning and continuous improvement happening, but also acknowledging that there are a number of things that the county and city don't know yet or haven't decided yet. And so those have been the basis of the questions that we've raised in these meetings. And some of them we've framed as dilemmas, right? These are hard choices where there is no easy answer. And all that together is what creates those big, hairy questions that we hope today you'll continue to help us think through, like what are options, what are the implications of different choices, particularly the impacts on equity. And so these are this is the way we framed the 2 big hairy questions to begin with. How do we center equity in the core funding process? How can we use the core conditions as a framework for making decisions about funding allocations? So we had a lot of good discussion about that in last week's meeting with community partners. And so I'll share some of the key themes we've been hearing, not only from last week's meeting, but meetings with the funders as well. And I'll share some of the kind of clusters of themes and then kind of variations on or different perspectives that we've also heard in some of these categories. So starting with the application itself, we heard loud and clear, keep the application simple, keep it streamlined, only ask for information that is essential, that's actually going to be used and is needed, provide options to submit non-written materials like videos. We heard the word transparency a lot. And so in the context of the application itself and the RFP, we heard requests for things like sharing the RFP and the scoring criteria in advance, meaning before the official public release. Give as much lead time as possible for the applications and avoid the holidays if at all possible. We heard suggestions around possibly having different processes or applications for small funding requests versus larger ones as a way to kind of, again, even the playing field, and to provide continuous technical assistance and support because it really helps build capacity, not only for this particular core funding opportunity, but really for applying for grants in general. Like some of the skills and capacity building could be helpful for other funding sources as well. At the same time, we heard things like in these meetings with funders and community partners, we did hear kind of another point of view that, simplicity still requires effort for both funders and applicants. That sometimes even the RFPs that say, tell us in a few words, right? What the purpose or what is the impact of your program, that it still takes a lot of effort to really figure out how do you distill the essence of what you do in a few words. And there was also acknowledgement that simple doesn't necessarily mean that biases go away, right? The biases will still exist, and that sometimes there's the potential to oversimplify things, which could actually increase the chances that biased decision-making creeps in. And also there were reminders, and this came up particularly in the funders meetings, about just the differences between what government funders can do as stewards of taxpayer dollars versus what private philanthropy can do, and that there aren't necessarily always the same opportunities or options for flexibility. And so it's just something to be aware of, and you'll hear more about that later from Randy. In the area of data and priorities, some of the key themes we heard was some suggestions that, well, the county and city should set specific priorities about what they want to fund based on data and focus on those who are most in need or marginalized. And so, one of the things that's different now compared to the first round of core funding is that we do have some great resources available now that didn't exist before. So we have DataShare Santa Cruz County now, that's a central hub for a lot of community level indicators. We have the core results menu that groups or identifies community impact statements that are linked to community data, and all of that lives on DataShare. So a lot of good resources that can be helpful. And at the same time, we heard and we fully acknowledge that there are still data gaps that exist, right? DataShare doesn't have data on everything, every possible thing. So some of you might find that DataShare or other sources, make it easier to find data. Others will still be looking. We also did hear, as kind of like a counterpoint to the county and city setting specific priorities, we heard some suggestions about having applicants be the ones to say, these are the needs and inequities that we see. This is the data that tells us that. Here's how we would solve the problem. So really it's more applicant driven versus funder driven. And also we heard comments and requests about, finding the right balance between responding to the crisis of now, meaning particularly the inequities and needs that we're seeing resulting from COVID and the wildfires, and also balancing that with thinking about the future and prevention and, wanting to just also seeing that as an aspect of equity. When it comes to evidence, as you can imagine, we heard lots of comments, lots of ideas and feedback. But, I think probably the overarching theme is that, we heard reminders or requests to structure this RFP in a way that really allows for innovation, not just requires kind of the traditional evidence-based programs and practices, that have the randomized control trials, which actually is how the first core RFP was structured. There actually was kind of this concept of levels of evidence that included a level that was specifically called innovative. But because at that time, just the concept of evidence-based programs and practices was so new, there was some, confusion or lack of clarity around the definitions of the levels of evidence. this definitely is an area that can be improved, has been improved in the time since then. And we also heard comments in the meetings about, don't let go of existing effective evidence-based programs and practices and evaluation tools that have been used or developed for the current core contracts. So this idea of don't completely throw everything out and start over, that it is important to think about making sure that evidence and data and the way we define it doesn't become a barrier for some organizations and have that contribute to inequities, but also recognize the really strong and effective programs that do exist, and that a lot of organizations feel a great amount of pride in the way they've been able to implement evidence-based practices and programs with fidelity and flexibility. In the area of equity, again, we heard a lot of comments and suggestions, and really woven all throughout all of these kind of categories I'm reviewing. We heard some suggestions about, making equity an explicit part of the scoring criteria so that it really sends a clear message that this is a priority. And I think in one of the funders meetings, someone used that phrase, equity is the price of admission or something like that. So this idea of it's more than just talk. There were suggestions and requests about, find ways to incorporate or acknowledge the need to address wage equity as part of, when we think about equity in general. And also, we heard kind of different ways of thinking about this, that, a real, I think, strong feeling or request that, through the review process or through the RFP, to recognize that equity is an ongoing process. So I think agencies, applicants, not wanting to feel like they'll be somehow penalized for being, at an earlier stage in their learning process. And then, to create the space and funding and technical assistance for organizations to focus on equity. So there isn't just this kind of unfunded expectation and unsupported expectation that everybody is on an equity journey. Lots and lots of comments about the review process and review panels, and they all were mainly kind of in the same line of suggestions, so we don't have kind of the counterpoints to these here, but lots of suggestions around, really draw on local experts and community members who are most affected by inequities. We did hear some suggestions about using experts from other areas and counties, some suggestions about having different reviewers for different pieces of the application, kind of separating the technical parts from the more programmatic parts, and suggesting, training for reviewers to make sure that they had some shared understanding of what core is, how we think about equity in our community, and to create opportunities for applicants, for the reviewers, to ask applicants for clarification during that review process, so that the review process isn't just like a kind of closed off, oh, you either made it or you didn't, you're scored high or low, and then there's no opportunity for kind of feedback or clarification during that process. And even after the reviews and scoring are done, there was a suggestion to provide feedback to applicants that weren't funded, that weren't recommended for funding, because that could still be a valuable part of a learning process for organizations. And then again, this word transparency, just kept hearing that transparency about the panel formation, how the review process is handled. So again, you'll hear more about that, what can and can't be done from Randy. And in this, I think this is the last area here in terms of scoring. Again, not necessarily counterpoints, but here we've grouped it by what we heard from community partners, who are many of the nonprofits that are likely to be applying for funds versus funders. So from community partners, we just heard over and over, make the expectations really clear, communicate about that. Don't make us guess what you're looking for. Have transparency around the scoring criteria. And then, if there appears to be some kind of a disconnect between an applicant's scores and the actual amount that they got awarded or whether or not they got awarded, to provide some clarification and explanation about that, because otherwise it can lead to, just confusion and mixed messages and all kinds of, rumors and narratives that can live on and on. And from the funders' perspective, they had some great suggestions about And actually, some of the funders talk about how they've incorporated these strategies in their own review processes to remind and train reviewers that they're looking for and rating the quality of ideas and solutions versus rating on things like grammar or how pretty are their graphics or how beautiful their proposal package is. That those kinds of things can really feel like they disadvantage certain agencies versus others. And again, this idea of separating the technical review from the programmatic review. So that is a whirlwind tour of the key themes we've heard. There's a lot more detail behind those that Nicole and I are continuing to sift through and summarize in notes. But this one, I'm going to have Randy share a little bit more about kind of where this leaves HSD and the city in terms of what can be done and what can't be done in a public process.
Yeah, so thank you, Nicole. So I mentioned this in my introductory comments. This slide is the what can be done. We're starting with the glass half full and then lead to the second slide, which is what can't be done. Before going to the second slide, I want to offer some candor, full disclosure. When we get to the what can't be done, because I want to just frame this, separating out, I think is important in terms of integrity and being kind of frank with everybody while we have a little time for dialogue. I'm not only informed by consultation with my own contracting unit, who are quite expert in the regulations and laws that govern public procurement, but this is the candor. In my former jurisdiction, I worked in lots of county human services programming and sat in lots of board chamber meetings where I watched public partners do public procurement. And I have the experience of watching about 5 very, very, very ugly public procurements that were appealed. And I saw both the politics and the technical aspects of public procurement, where when you don't deal with these issues up front, things go wrong later because rules weren't followed. So the what can't be done is informed by law, rules, public procurement practices, and a lot of experience that I've seen. So I just wanted, the disclosure I want to give is I'm very invested in being very clear about what we're trying to avoid in the future. When and if we get to a point where there are some questions by applicants or interested parties that felt they should have got more money or didn't get money, we have to be very clean and clear up front. So I just want to be honest about that. So what can we do? What has nothing to do with, or at least I hope, with politics and public procurement technical rules, is we can do what we are endeavoring to do right now, and that is just be really honest, try to be very clear, try to be very candid, try to have ongoing communication. As I said in my introductory remarks, invite feedback, listen to your feedback, try to incorporate that feedback. And so that is, clearly a process point, an integrity point, and hopefully that is helpful. Number 2, this was mentioned in Nicole's overview. We are building in opportunities for training in TA once the RFP is released. These tools have been built and trying to give everybody an opportunity to take advantage of them, so the playing field is as fair as possible, and anybody who have questions that we minimize applications coming in that are just based on not understanding rules and process. So we have built in training, TA, and support throughout this process, including once the RFP is released in a neutral way through our contract with the Nicoles. And then the last one is just recognizing that this is an iterative process. This is round 2 after 35 years of this community funding one particular way. It was only 5 years ago, after 35 years of one way, that a public procurement process was done. And this is round 2. And I can guarantee you, and I hope to be here during round 3, we will make even more adjustments, as I said in my introductory remarks. So this is going to be a continuous improvement process. It's going to be iterative, and we'll hopefully, if we do bucket number 1, clear, candid, continuous communication, together we will move along. I do want to make a comment about equity. My first venture in county human services started a long time ago, was in county foster care. And there was a lot of contracts put out there where issues of equity were necessary. Like, how do we make sure the contracts we have to help the mission of a government foster care system address equities and deal with inequities, and not have children, depending on where they're born or their income or their skin color, be disproportionately impacted. I've been in this journey about how to apply equity. It is complicated, it's not simple, and I recognize that I'm new here, and I hope that we can just all work together on how we do, in a very sincere and real way, integrate equity into this continuous improvement process. It's a general comment, but it's all very local. How issues of inequity land are very specific to kind of what's happening at the local level. So I humbly welcome feedback as a new member who's been sitting in an office for a year and a half and not in the community because of the pandemic. So those are the things that we believe can be done and we're committed to doing. And I hope my introductory comment said there's still room for us to do all these things before the RFP is released. So then this leads to the bureaucratic realities. So these are what I said, you know, what cannot we do? I do want to invite you to a moment on the horizon where if we put this RFP out, if we put the rating panels out, if we've done all we can to be fair and honest, and if we end up at a point where either politically or technically an applicant contests and grieves the results, these what can't we do are why we can't do them. So first, we can do all we can to get your feedback to try to help inform the drafting of the RFP that we will then share publicly, that will be viewable Thursday night before a Tuesday board meeting, date to be determined. And the associated scoring criteria. We can do all we can to have public dialogue. But the reason we can't share an actual draft is because then there is tons of room for there to be criticism that certain parties had bandwidth or a bigger organization or ability to look at it in advance, or if you look at it and you give us feedback and then that organization's awarded, another organization can say, well, the feedback from agency X got it and that's why they got. So the clean way to deal with this and avoid appeals, which likely would be approved, is by not sharing anything draft form, but more just having these conceptual discussions and then sharing the RFP and the scoring criteria the date they go public through the public process, which is posting it the Thursday night before the actual discussion with the board. So we cannot for those reasons, and I hope that sounds not controlling, but just honest about the process. Second, perhaps differently or maybe even more controversial. My experience I referenced in my former jurisdiction, most of the successful appeals of rating criteria were because of conflicts of interest on rating panels. So we have a tension to manage here. Heard, understood, agreed, having local subject matter experts reviewing. But how do we do that given this is a discussion with a lot of nonprofit organizations who apply, who by definition, if you or a board member of yours or a volunteer or somebody in some way affiliated with a local nonprofit is a rater, how do we deal with an appeal saying that rater was biased toward the organization that was awarded money? There isn't an answer to that. And that's a very technical issue about how to make sure that we have a clean rating panel. But it does create an absolute tension that we invite a little bit of dialogue before we, because we do not have rating panelists identified. So I just want to kind of put that out there and make it very clear when you get the end of this why it is we have to carefully figure out who to put on the panel that has local expertise but will not have a conflict of interest. Related to that, we cannot share the identity of panelists before applications or deadlines are submitted because we run the risk of, at that appeal point, an applicant saying they had access to because they knew who the raters were and there was undue influence. So that's another reason. It is public record once it's out and the rating's done and over, and that is often shared. And then the other is perhaps a little bit more nuanced, but to do all we can to minimize any perception of undue influence by raters, giving to all the raters who we will endeavor to be as neutral as possible. For them to have a big list of who's getting funded and who's not getting funded could be perceived as undue influence by biasing their perception when they're reviewing applications. So that ends kind of the high level review of, based on feedback over the last few meetings, questions, our best effort to explain to you why these issues we see in the bucket of can't be done. And I'll turn it back to you, Nicole, and we have, again, ample opportunity to have more dialogue about that today and in the Survey Monkey.
Yeah, and there's one question in the chat, Randy. I'm thinking maybe if you can say a few words about it before we take our break, that might be good to see if there's an answer for this one. Lori is saying that California state agencies regularly share draft RFPs for public comment through a public process before its final release. Can you share how this process is different?
Yeah, fair question. And we actually had that internal conversation with my own contracting unit. We ourselves as county are sometimes applicants to federal grants, and it is often the case that the federal government opens a grant for comment period before, and then they kind of go back internally and huddle. There's a decision point to be made here. Our assessment is that technically we run a lot of risk in a small community with a lot of small organizations of sort of unintentionally weaving in some bias. So I think what the sweet spot we're endeavoring to strike is not sharing the actual RFP itself, but having these conversations that have played out this past couple of months and the conversations that are going to play out in the next month, so that everyone's interest in what makes it into an RFP is woven into the RFP, so that it's not the actual technical issue of the RFP released in draft and then some parties, reviewed it in advance and got an unfair advantage. So that's the sweet spot we're trying to travel. It's a very fair point, and that's part of the discussion we had internally, and I'm kind of sharing with you. Hopefully that's responsive.
Great, thank you, Randy.
So as you've heard, there are many things to grapple with, but we've tried to organize them into these two big, hairy questions of how should the county and city of Santa Cruz allocate the core funds using an equity lens, and then how should the county and city design and implement the actual proposal review process with an equity lens. So we have designed the small group discussions around these two questions. So you'll be sent to one of 4 groups. 2 groups will discuss question number 1, and 2 groups will discuss question number 2. You'll still have an opportunity to weigh in on either question during the larger group discussion and in some of the events following this meeting, including the survey that Nicole described. In each of the 4 breakout groups, there'll be a designated facilitator who will guide the discussion and try and keep everything on track for the roughly 20 minutes we'll have together in the small groups. And we're also planning to record those discussions strictly for note-taking. Those recordings will not be distributed or shared with the large group. It's really just to capture the notes that generate the kinds of insights that you've seen so far. We want to track what we're hearing and make sure that we're not missing anything. And then in the small groups, we'll start out with just some quick introductions. And if you could share who you're representing, and then something about your level of experience with applying for grants. So it might be none, a little, some, or a lot, just so we can get a sense of the different levels of grant writing and applying experience in the small groups. So I'll go over some of the questions now, but you'll also have, as I mentioned, a facilitator guiding you through these questions, and each group will have a Google Doc that will have the notes in it, so you can see the notes as they're being taken and add to them if you'd like. So for groups 1 and 2, you'll be talking about the overarching question of how should the county and city allocate core funds using an equity lens. So some of the dilemmas that we're grappling with and the city and county are grappling with that many of you are familiar with is the equity impact of funding either broadly across a number of core conditions, for example, or programs and agencies, or deeply, fewer topics, fewer agencies and programs, but with greater depth. So those are the kinds of challenges that don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer, but we expect you'll have opinions about the pros and cons of each approach, and we would like to hear those. If the funding is allocated more deeply or narrowly, then who should decide that? Who decides what to prioritize? Would you expect the county and city to do that as funders, or are you leaning in the direction of applicants, perhaps with different levels of community engagement, are the ones defining those needs and priorities? So again, there are different ways that could work for everybody. Not that the same approach won't work the same way for everybody, but we want to hear your ideas about the advantages and disadvantages of these different dimensions and approaches that we're grappling with. If you're in groups 3 and 4, the overarching question is, how should the county and city of Santa Cruz design and implement the actual proposal review process with an equity lens? So this includes defining who is an expert. So we've talked about subject matter experts who might have more knowledge of different programs, different needs, different issues in the community. Who decides that? How do we determine that? And then for those who've suggested, for example, that it might be good to have an objective out-of-county reviewer to do at least part of the review, if that's something that you're interested in or have experienced elsewhere, how is that allocated? What's the proportion of local versus out-of-county panelists, for example? And then we've heard a lot about the word transparency in these discussions, and we know it means different things to different people. So for example, does it mean a reassurance that you're getting all the information that can publicly be shared before, during, and after the RFP process? Or is it more that you want to know things like reviewers' names and backgrounds, or how they scored the different proposals, some of which, as Randy mentioned, is not possible. So we want to know what that word transparency means in terms of clarity about the information, when it's shared and with whom. So let's go ahead and get into our groups.
And then just to let everyone know, there will be, some of you will automatically be sent to a breakout room. We're doing random assignments, and some of you are going to stay in this main room because this will be the fourth group. And so you'll stay here with me. So you don't get transported through cyberspace. That's on purpose. And we'll have about 25 minutes total for these discussions. You'll see after 23 minutes, you'll see the 2-minute countdown timer start. So it just means you have to start wrapping up your conversation so you don't get cut off in the middle of a sentence. Okay, everybody ready?
Look for that timer and see you on the other side, unless you're staying in the main room.
Looks like everybody is back. Did everybody make it back? Okay, so Nicole Lezin is going to guide us through the report outs, and we'll hear from each of the groups, a little summary of what the group discussion was like. But we also want to leave time for Randy, and I think I saw Ben is still on here. I'm not sure if Ralph is still on here, but any of the county and city staff to, like, if they have follow-up questions or clarifying questions, we want to give them a chance to ask those. And then if there's time, I know that there were some other lingering questions in the chat that if we have time, we'll try to address those today as well.
Excuse me, Nicole, can you turn on the interpreting, please?
Yes, thank you, Stella, for reminding me. And so everybody will have to reselect a language channel again to make sure that we can all hear each other.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Let's start with group 4. Let's hear just some quick highlights from your discussion. And I know from our group, it's going to be hard to capture in a minute or two, but as Nicole said, we want to keep some time for exchange here. So group 4, what were some of the highlights from what you discussed?
All right, well, I would say that, you know, in a nutshell, the 2 overarching themes that I heard, and obviously, you know, the other people in the room would have more to add to that this needs to be looked at as a partnership, that we need to get the competition out of the process and look for ways that all the organizations, most of whom know each other already, who are trying to do this work, get together and think about how can we get this work done, and that be the first step, that we need to think about how this process continues to replicate a framework of white supremacy and gatekeeping for that, and we need to figure out ways to increase the pie and lower the gatekeeping.
Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about group 3. We had that same question about how should the county and city design and implement the review process with an equity lens. So we talked about who are the experts just making these decisions. So we talked about how in a small community like ours, it shouldn't be disqualifying to be part of the nonprofit or applicant community, maybe not a direct connection like a board member deciding on an organization's funding, but just that should be appreciated, that we have expertise in the community, bringing in different levels like field staff or frontline workers, as well as some of the supervisors or management teams, and looking at not just a range of levels, but lived experience as well, and balancing the quantitative and qualitative data that are asked for. So not just looking at data and statistics. And then we had a couple thoughts about ratios we talked about local versus out of county panelists, kind of landed on a 75% local, 25% out of county type of ratio, so that there would be some ideas and objectivity from out of county, but the consensus was we're so unique and it would be hard for outsiders to really understand the landscape here the way that our local reviewers would. And then finally, in the question of transparency, we talked a lot about the kinds of information people will be looking for. So how does the scoring relate to the allocation of funds? Who makes that decision? Getting feedback if you don't score well in particular dimensions. So I think one comment was I'd rather have answers that I don't like than no answers at all. And then possibly releasing the scoring for all the organizations applying in a category, even if it's not tied to a specific organization, but just to know kind of where you are in a range. So that's a very quick tour. Group 3, feel free to chime in other dimensions of what we talked about in the chat. What about group 2?
Thanks, Nicole.
Was that your group? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, it was. So we had the question about how equity shows up in terms of, do we go with funding breadth of programs or core conditions, or depth, fewer organizations with larger amounts of funding? And I would say the key theme was emphasizing partnerships that are characterized by accountability and transparency. We had an acknowledgement that many organizations are touching the same clients. So there could be a broad types of services that are provided to the same focus population, which would lead to depth of impact. That community proposals often will speak to trends and that go to the underlying and cross-cutting needs. There was musing about what if we merge the depth and breadth by providing funding and having the request that organizations leverage the funding by somehow using it to access special, an additional amount of funding in a second round, or using it as a basis for garnering awards from other funding entities. There was a request to try to create space for learning throughout the process for both funders and the organizations themselves. An emphasis on how intersectional approaches, for example, including the environmental impact, the climate resiliency's implications of programming in funding that may be associated with another core condition, would lead to greater reach. And finally, the always an eye toward balancing long-term versus urgent needs, particularly as they land on our most fragile community members. And I'll stop there. That's my tour de force. But group 2 members, please fill up the chat if I left out anything salient.
Great tour, and thank you. And thanks to all of you adding in the chat. It's hard to get every point in, so we count on all of you to help us flush these out. Nicole, what about group 1?
Yeah, so we also talked about the issue about funding broadly versus deeply, and whether to fund many core conditions or many programs and services versus many populations versus few. And started off with an acknowledgement of, all 8 core conditions are so interconnected that they feel equally weighted. And so it's hard to, say like one should be prioritized over another. And so another way to think about it is, I think similar to what Caitlin was just describing, focusing on populations and really looking at what are the services, resources, opportunities that they need in order to achieve health or experience health and well-being in multiple core conditions. And at the same time, we also heard comments about, that there may still be some gaps in the way that the core conditions are defined. And so that might be a matter of, maybe there are specific core conditions that don't quite capture everything. It might also be a matter of kind of drilling down and understanding what's beneath each of those core conditions a little bit more to see like where and how, it helps us connect the dots and tell a common story about community needs in these different areas. We had, quite a bit of back and forth about ideas around, on one hand, identifying the organizations that are experienced at providing services and funding them, because they have the experience, they have the staff, they'll be prepared to deliver services. And then that question about, well, how might that potentially still create barriers or limit the opportunities for maybe smaller organizations or newer organizations to have an opportunity to apply. And so I think we just kind of replicated a lot of the difficult questions that are, that we're aware of, just that every option, every choice has a ripple effect or potential that, just needs to be thought through really carefully. So I think, good discussion. It gives me some more ideas about things that we might look at in terms of some of the ways that we share information or define some of those core conditions and how those might be used. And again, anyone else in group 1, feel free to weigh in the chat if I missed anything.
Great, thank you. I wanted to give Randy and Ralph and Ben, representing the city and county, some airtime here to ask any clarifying questions from the whirlwind tours you've just heard from each of the groups.
This is Randy just skimming to see if Ralph is still there, because I want to give deference. This has been very county centric, but I can't see if he's still on. And he can pass too, and I can share my thoughts, but is Ralph on?
I don't see Ralph.
Doesn't look like he is.
Okay.
So all yours.
Well, that's why it's county centric. So I think I want to remind everybody, at least from my perspective, the importance of, for those who just participated today, for those who participated previous ones, or those who've been thinking about this for a while and have a real interest in this 1-week survey. I think you can only say so much in a breakout room and on this platform, but we are going to read what you have to say and kind of figure out how to best inform them. And then there's those other moments. And please also say if you feel like there'd be benefit for people's busy lives to have one more check-in in a video platform in September. So just want to remind people that's following, and that's important to me. And then I'll delicately and carefully say on behalf of the breakout rooms I've been in, boy, we're not getting any clear answers, just a lot of recognition of the complexity of this. So I'd like to make a comment and then tell you a couple things on my mind that I particularly appreciate those who want to participate in the survey. So I think DeAndre asked a question that I didn't answer, and I actually am choosing. I think it was such a good question. I want to make sure everyone's aware. So his question in the chat was like, how much money are we talking about? Well, right, if we're talking about $100,000, why are we meeting? So the public full disclosure information is the current aggregate of all the contracts that are in the current core contracts is a little over 4.4 million. At today's forum, we're not going to be talking about, but we'll be talking about in front of the board if that can be expanded and added to. The reason we don't know the answer to that is twofold. One is this is not county human services money. County Human Services administers this, but this is actually the CAO's office in consult with the board adding or not general fund money to that pot. So I anticipate if I'm you as a service provider, you would like to see that pot grow as much as possible. The county is just finishing its closeout process So I anticipate in the next week or two, once closeout is done, there'll be an internal conversation, and then that 4.4 may be larger. And that is something you all should advocate for, because ultimately that's a board decision with the CAO. That we just manage the money. So I want to put that as one comment to answer DeAndre's question, but just to kind of keep this real, some really good dialogue in my breakout room this time and before. I think it's important to be really honest, like $4.4 million, that's fantastic that this county puts a big chunk of money out there. But just to put it in context, my department, which is the second largest next to health, that's a touch larger, our budget is $160 million. So to try to pretend that $4.4 million is going to solve the issues of the holes in the safety net is not realistic. Our $160 million still leaves huge holes in unmet need, despite having lots of federal and state money. So I think it's like a scaling question, and how can we best together talk through how to take this money and put it out to bid and spread it wide, target, given it's not going to solve anything specifically, but how can it help move the needle in important areas? It's something I'd love to hear people respond to. And I think the two things that I mean, they were the two questions, but what we didn't get to in my breakout room, and it's really hard to figure out, is operationalizing equity. Of course, is a really complicated conversation, but I just feel like I need to recognize equity is an umbrella statement of which there are many, 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 many tentacles. So if people have thoughts about what that means, I spent in my prior job before coming here being the director of a division in human services focused on aging and disability after almost 20 years in child welfare. And I came to realize, my goodness, the inequities in terms of lack of services to people who have cognitive decline and fragmented systems. So, you know, just age and ability can be an equity issue, race and ethnicity, geography, poverty. So how to slice and dice equity is not just a simple high level, how do you operationalize? Well, and we have discretion. This isn't a federal or state funded program. It's this county's dollars to apply in the way we want. So I would appreciate anybody who wants to put in your Survey Monkey response or between now and when we release this, any thoughts you have. Many of you have done a lot of work in this. And then the second is, my goodness, the breakout room I was on, I kept waiting for somebody to have the magic secret sauce for how to decide allocation formulas. And I felt the tension, which is like, on one end, will you just tell us? Or the other end, will you just let us have a wide open lane? There's a lot there to decide. You can do it by the core conditions, you can do it by population. There's many ways you can do it. You can break up grant sizes. So very, very interested for all of you, whether you be a funder or you be a service provider or both, to share your perspective. I think I understand the complexity of the problem, so it's okay if you want to just share more about the problem, but I would rather you share, like, what do you recommend we do about it? How do you recommend we articulate to the board in that draft framework that will be in front of the board at the end of September? We will read what you say. So those are my comments, Nicole. I'll turn it back to you. I hope that's helpful, but please know this Survey Monkey is a very real process, and we're going to be reading. So it will be worth your time if you can make the time to share some other thoughts.
Thank you, Randy. And I think this discussion has convinced at least one person that it's, as you put it, it's easier to receive than to give. So David, thanks for that. Daydreaming about being a funder and realizing maybe it's a little more complicated, as you know. DeAndre, you have a comment in the chat about making a bigger pie, maybe the idea of creating more money in perpetuity. And you say you have an idea, so we'd love to hear it.
I'm sorry, I got to unmute myself. No, well, I live in, and I don't want to take up too much time. I live in the world of endowments, right? And I know how to manage those. We know how to manage those in the community, right? And there's two organizations. I'm not the only one, but you got the Community Foundation also that manages endowments, and we do it in a large way. There's been a California endowment that they tried to use for a multitude of ways and larger scales amount of money to drive change in different communities. And so you have, and it's not one organization, but you have two organizations in your community that does this work, right? And so how do we use those organizations? How do we partner with those organizations to do that? How to have these funds that are directed to go directly into these pies, but in perpetuity though, and that the county and government can continue to add to or fund or be a part of or drive or B, so we can continue to have these funds. And so 4.4 doesn't be 4.4 every year fighting for. 4.4 becomes 10, 12, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever. We want to make that to be for long-term use. And that's my quick comment. And I know that's I'm saying that very easy, and it's more harder to do than I'm saying, but I'm saying there's an idea or thought process to do that.
Okay, thanks, DeAndre. We'll follow up. And Randy, I also want to bring to your attention, and Ben, some of the questions in the chat about what specifically you think has been learned from the last RFP. I think Tim had a question about deficiencies, problems, or changes that you already know are being addressed in this turn, in our continuous improvement efforts between cycle 1, cycle 2, and whatever comes next.
I don't want to put Ben on the spot, but because you keep naming this guy Ben, if people don't know Ben, Ben is the manager of our contracts unit. Ben, right to pass if you don't want to weigh in, but he was here and I was not. So I want to be honest, I'm kind of picking up history as described to me. And I'd say a couple comments. One, I said this at the last meeting. I really struggle with the narratives in the community about this and how polarized they are. And it's really difficult to sort out fact from fiction from narrative. So that's just one comment that I recognize this has been a controversial enough process. And as I said last time, some of the narratives I fact checked and there's facts to the contrary. So I'm just aware of the power of narratives. And I just hope one of the lessons learned is looking forward, we can figure out how we communicate together so that even if we disagree, we kind of have a shared understanding of facts and truth. And where and if there are narratives being generated that don't help the process, we kind of figure out how to work on that. So I feel like I've inherited one issue, which is like this stuff that's playing out in DC. There are two different groups that just cannot have a common understanding of what happened and just ends up being very polarized and fighting. So that's one comment I'd like to work through as a matter of process. There was a lessons learned document, and I don't want to just put this right back on you, Nicole, but I read that a long time ago, but there was an exercise to go review what happened that was done in partnership and named and recognized. I believe that was shared through the core steering committee and coffee chats. And it is my understanding that this process we're going through right now is an attempt to apply the lessons learned so that the process is more inclusive and transparent and engaging, so that when we get to the board on the 28th, it is more reflective of those lessons learned and a sincere exchange of ideas. So it's a little bit processes comment. I don't have the history on the technical side. And again, don't want to out Ben, but he was here if he wants to add anything or if there's any other comments, but that's my best effort to share my take on it.
Just a minor correction, Randy. I actually wasn't also here. I probably have maybe another year and a half of experience ahead of yours, sort of dealing with the core process. But I do echo sort of your sentiments in that the narratives are very powerful, and my understanding again is that we're operationalizing through these conversations some of the primary points of concerns in terms of lessons learned from the last process.
Thank you, Ben. And Laura, I wanted to give you some time. I'm seeing your comment in the chat about maybe some organizations or even all organizations giving up certain aspects of ownership or feeling expectations about these funds and how that could be part of a reboot or a different thinking. So I wanted to give you some airtime for that.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I do have some strong feelings about this, as I'm sure everyone does. But one of the things I've had to realize is if I pull back my personal feelings about my services being so important, then it comes down to, like, let's just look at the data. And whether that's quantitative or qualitative, or I would hope both, let's look at the data. And let's start with basic needs. I mean, I feel really strongly that it's wonderful to have certain projects and organizations serving populations that may not be in as much need, but we're talking about a limited amount of dollars. And I feel like we have to go deep and targeted, and that's going to leave a lot of us out. we are not going to get there if we don't admit that. We have to admit that. And we have to be willing and accept that. And we have to start seeking other sources of funds. I mean, that's the bottom line. I'm preparing already. I know my organization may lose the money I've depended on for many years because it may not be a priority to fund dental services. I can accept that. So I'm already preparing for that inevitability. And don't get me wrong, we will still apply, we will still compete, we will still try to be the best and win, right? But it's not about winning. I shouldn't say it facetiously. It's really about serving a need. And those needs have been defined, they have been quantified. Now we need to measure who's doing it well, and we need to select them. That's what a competitive RFP is based on, right? We can't be afraid of that. We can't be scared about the competitiveness that this is going to require. So I know a lot of people won't agree with me, but that's my opinion.
Thank you, Laura.
May I jump in and piggyback on that candor, Laura, with my candor about process? I feel a responsibility to share with you what, I don't know how long I'm allowed to say I'm a new set of eyes. I've been here a year and a half now. Because this is county general fund, and I do see a question about city, and it's too bad Ralph's not here because I don't want to speak for city. But I guess a couple comments, and I actually see Paulina just threw this in. Data is complicated because I think when you're talking about the safety net, I'm going to call it broadly, where health and human services of public systems and you all as contract providers or funders, like my goodness, if you go back in history, you talk about how equity is misused by people of privilege to tell a story. Just data is very complicated. So I think it's important and it's complicated. But my process point to what I'm hearing from Laura is, and I don't know if this is realistic, my sense of the Board of Supervisors, who I will be in front of, is they too struggle with, should this money be targeted narrowly to get a deeper impact on a narrow set of issues? Or, and I'm going to say this provocatively just because, spread the money around so there's fewer people upset and more money goes around. But it's probably not going to have. My sense of this board is if there was a collective, and that doesn't mean everybody, agreement between public and partners about which way to go, the board would probably be inclined to support that. And I'm saying this from a place of neutrality because I think either way is good. You all nonprofits, you got a whole story to tell about the suffering of survival with the economy and stuff. So just getting the money around to people to help support you. But there could be another argument, which I'm hearing Laura say. In my position, I'd much prefer to make a recommendation of a bold change if it was the collective interest of the community partners who are thinking about providing, because then I can lift up and say this process we've been through in the last 3 months led to a general, leaning towards this, because the board isn't going to want to then deal with all the other people who say no. So the default is kind of similar funding patterns, but if there's collective interest, and this is not the place to resolve this in 3 minutes, but in the Survey Monkey and the conversations I'm just sharing with you, I'm very open, and I think the board is very open. Their concern is going to be if it's going to create a mess of public comment. So put yourself in my shoes and help through the Survey Monkey, and let's talk this through. We've got another month to kind of make some decisions.
Okay, thanks, Randy. And I know we're not covering every single question, but I think we've touched on some really important themes, including just more to grapple with. It may not feel that way, but it does to Nicole. I think I can speak for both of us, to the core team. As we've gone through this process with all of you and listened and had these meetings, it does feel like we're getting somewhere. It's just not as crystal clear and it may never be as crystal clear as everybody would want, but just airing these issues, talking them through and realizing where the trade-offs lie has been really important. So thank you for participating in that and grappling right along with us and continuing to do so. Nicole's going to mention some of the things upcoming. So I want to make sure that we get that out there. And we hope to see you both in survey responses. There's a feedback survey up and in some upcoming events that Nicole will go over.
And before I talk about next steps, I think I also just want to put it out there that because I hear and I see in some of the comments in the chat kind of the concern or the worries about like, well, we don't have data yet, or we don't have that capacity yet to provide the kind of data that might make for a good proposal. And so I would want to encourage us to think about, instead of that having be the reason to say, oh, then we shouldn't do something, to really give us suggestions or tell us like what you would need, right, to make that feasible, to build that kind of capacity. Because if 5 years from now, if we're still saying, you know, that, well, we can't collect that data, or we don't have that data, it means that we're not paying attention to the right things also. That, you know, that we might need to also broaden our ways of thinking about how do we collectively build capacity for collective impact across our community. So just wanted to put that out there too. So again, just to recap, so we are still in this engagement process. That's, you know, we're really working towards making sure that we've had a thorough and really good process for gathering inputs before HSD, the Human Service Department, and the city take their recommendations for a framework to the Board of Supervisors and City Council. So again, that's why we're having such a heavy focus on this input process right now. And so the survey that Randy has been mentioning, we'll send it out tomorrow. I'm actually thinking that we might make a few changes to it based on some of our discussion today. So we, you know, encourage you to use that, even if you participated today and feel like you shared your ideas, that you might want to weigh in on one of the other group discussions that you didn't get to participate in, or you just want to really make sure that your ideas and recommendations are captured. And I would say feel free to share that survey with other staff or colleagues that weren't able to attend today, as long as you're also sharing some of the context and the background materials about these meetings, because it'll be hard to make sense of some of the survey comments if we don't really know, like, okay, have they heard or participated or really understand some of these concepts around, you know, the core conditions and collective impact and things like that. So we'll send that out tomorrow in a follow-up email along with the recordings of the main sessions from today. We're not going to share the videos of all the breakout sessions, but we'll share that as well as the slides so that you can kind of forward the whole thing to other staff and other people in your organization. Again, on the 30th, we have the core steering committee meeting coming up. Some of you on this call are members of that core steering committee. That's really just a point in the process to make sure that some of our, you know, organizational leaders that have been helping create and influence the development of core over the last, you know, several years are also hearing and up to speed on all these discussions that have been happening. The City of Santa Cruz has a community programs committee that will also be meeting at some point, I think in early September. I don't know if we have a confirmed date yet, but they'll hear similar presentation as what we have all given you today. They'll hear the themes that have been coming out of all of these meetings. Those meetings, I believe, are open to the public. Those are, you know, public Brown Act meetings. And then I'm thinking that we, you know, unless we hear, no, don't bug us again about providing input on this, it probably will, you know, we probably will schedule another kind of core coffee chat or opportunity for people at least to come back together and hear like what the current thinking is before things start to get developed and sent to the board. And again, as Randy mentioned, on September 28th, that's an open public meeting. People are welcome and encouraged to submit their comments, attend to that meeting. And we hope that, again, that we can maintain that spirit of like that we're working through these hard issues together, even if we don't all agree with the eventual decision and path that's been recommended. But this has been extremely valuable, and just really appreciate the kind of openness and candor that everybody has been willing to, you know, to come to the table with. Thank you all so much.